What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through my top 36 running backs as we head into week 6 of the fantasy football season. As always, we're recording this on Tuesday. You are seeing this on Wednesday, but we've probably already put out our wide receiver rankings on the week. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you don't miss any future content. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these top 36 running back rankings. So as you can see, I have the tier maker pulled up on the screen right now. We got 7 tiers to get through all of the 36 running backs in today's video. But let's kick it off here in tier 1. Tier 1 we're going to call elite running back ones here in week 6. And coming in as the number 1 guy for me, it is going to be Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. Now he plays against the Washington Commanders this week. And last week, Henry carried the ball 15 times for 92 yards and a touchdown. He also caught his only target for 4 yards in Sunday's overtime win versus the Bengals. And Henry has been on an absolute heater. He's now been an RB1 in each of his last 4 games and now has a matchup with the Commanders and a high projected game total with a projected positive game script here this week. So he's a smash play for me at the running back position. And now the last running back in this tier already, coming in at number 2, I do have Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles. Barkley, he's coming off of his week 5 bye week, and now he gets a matchup versus the Cleveland Browns, who currently rank 19th against the fantasy football running back position. Saquon, he's been a set it and forget it RB1 every single week this year, and with 2 of his first 4 games finishing as the running back 1 overall on the week, I expect a very similar type of volume and a very similar type of production here for him this week versus the Browns. Now let's move on to tier 2. Tier 2 is what we're going to call those high-end running back ones, and coming in as my number 3 guy, I got Jordan Mason of the San Francisco 49ers. They play against the Seattle Seahawks this week, and Mason, he rushed 14 times for 89 yards, and he caught his lone target for 9 yards while also losing a fumble in Sunday's 24-23 loss to the Arizona Cardinals. Mason, he failed to get into the end zone, and so far this year, when he fails to do that, he really doesn't give us the numbers that we want for fantasy football. But this week's matchup versus Seattle is going to be tougher than last week's. But if you can find the end zone, the volume will be there for another good fantasy football finish. So I do have him as a top 3 play still nonetheless. Now coming in for me at my running back 4, I do have Bijan Robinson. And I get it, Bijan hasn't performed so far this year, but he gets a matchup this week against the Carolina Panthers. Robinson rushed 12 times for 61 yards. He also brought in all 3 of his targets for 16 yards in the Falcons' overtime win versus the Buccaneers on Thursday night. There's been a ton of noise so far about Bijan and how he's underperformed to start the season, but the perfect fix for that underperforming running back so far this year has been the Carolina Panthers defense, which currently ranks dead last against the position. I'm rolling him out there again this week, but if he looks bad against this defense, we may have to start worrying for real about Bijan Robinson. Now coming in at running back 5, I got Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions. They play the Dallas Cowboys, and Gibbs, he's coming off of a bye week here in week 6 and has a matchup against a bad Cowboys run defense. I'd be looking at Gibbs as one of the better running back plays of the week just due to the matchup and the PPR upside that he possesses and the overall offensive efficiency of the Detroit Lions. Now coming in for me as running back 6, I do got Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs plays against the Arizona Cardinals this week, and Jacobs, he rushed the ball 19 times for 73 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's 24-19 win over the Rams. He also added 1 reception on 1 target for 21 yards receiving. This was the most opportunity that Jacobs has seen since week 2 of the season, and Jacobs gave us an RB1 performance. I would expect Jacobs to continue performing at a high level now that Jordan Love is back in the lineup, and with a good matchup this week against Arizona, he should be a great play for our fantasy football teams. And now the last player here in this tier for me, it is going to be number 7, and that is going to be Alvin Kamara versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Kamara, he rushed 11 times for 26 yards, and he caught 6 of 8 targets for 40 yards in Monday's loss to the Chiefs. We knew that this Chiefs defense was going to be a little bit tougher for Kamara than some of the other defenses that he's seen to start the year, but the matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week could be a little bit better than that one in a good divisional game against the Bucs. Now let's move on to tier 3. Tier 3, we're going to call that the low-end running back ones, and coming in as my running back 8, I got David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions as well. Monty is coming off of his bye week, and he has a great matchup this week versus the Cowboys, who have had some horrible performances against opposing running backs so far this year. This is a very high projected game total, and I expect Monty to continue performing for fantasy football teams. And Montgomery, he's been a top 20 running back in every single game this year. I think this week he cracks the top 10. Now coming in as my running back 9, I do have Breece Hall. Breece Hall plays against the Buffalo Bills, and Hall, he rushed the ball 9 times for 23 yards in Sunday's loss to the Vikings. He added 3 catches on 4 targets for 14 yards, and Hall has seen single-digit carries for the 2nd consecutive week now, but he's still the clear lead back to me in New York. He should have a better week this week against the Bills, who currently rank 31st against the running back position. Now coming in as my running back 10, I do have James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. They play against the Green Bay Packers, And Connor, he rushed 19 times for 86 yards and caught 2 of 3 targets for 14 yards in Sunday's win over San Francisco. Connor continues to dominate the backfield touches in Arizona with no other running back even receiving a carry last week behind him. Connor should remain a strong play here in week 6 against the Packers. And now the final player in this tier for me, coming in at running back 11, I got Kenneth Walker III. Walker, he rushed 5 times for 19 yards and he caught 7 of 8 targets for 57 yards in Sunday's loss to the Giants. Coming off of a super high in week 4 to a low in week 5, Walker, he still led the team in carries and he paced the team in targets as well. We can stick with Walker as a very good play here in week 6 versus the Niners defense that currently ranks in the middle of the pack against the fantasy football running back position. Now moving on to my tier 4. Tier 4 is what we're going to call safe running back 2s. Coming in as number 12, I got James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. James Cook, he plays against the New York Jets, and Cook rushed 20 times for 82 yards and a touchdown while catching 2 of 3 targets for 17 yards in Sunday's loss to the Texans. Cook, he continues to look like one of the better mid-round running back picks that managers could have made in drafts earlier this fall, and he's going to look to add upon a big year here in week 6 against a tough Jets defense that just fired their head coach. Now moving on to running back 13, I do have DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. They play against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Swift, he rushed 21 times for 73 yards and a touchdown while also catching both of his targets for 47 yards in Sunday's win over the Panthers. Swift now has 285 yards combined in his last 2 games, and he gets another great matchup this week against the Jaguars, so he should have another good game here on the horizon. I'd feel more than comfortable playing him as a high-end running back 2 here this week. Now moving on to my running back 14, I have Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans. They play against the Indianapolis Colts, and Pollard is coming off of his week 5 bye week, but his last performance was a solid outing for Pollard. He saw 24 opportunities and he finished as the RB15 on the week, and Pollard is seeing the majority of the rushing share in Tennessee this year and some decent receiving work as well. He should be a fine play here this week against a Colts defense that continues to struggle against the running back position in 2024. Now moving on to my running back 15, here's where I'm going to put Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard plays against the Atlanta Falcons, and Hubbard, he rushed 13 times for 97 yards and a touchdown and brought in all 4 targets for -2 yards in the Panthers' 36-10 loss to the Bears on Sunday. Hubbard now has 3 straight running back 1 performances for fantasy teams, but Jonathan Brooks is lingering in the background with a pup return on the horizon. That said, even if Brooks is activated this week, Hubbard should lead this backfield again in week 6 versus Atlanta. Now coming in at 16, I have Brian Robinson Jr. He plays against the Baltimore Ravens, and Robinson, he carried the ball 7 times for 18 yards and 2 touchdowns in Sunday's 34-13 win over the Browns. This was by far the worst rushing performance of the season for Robinson, who is dealing with an injury coming into the contest, but he's been an RB2 or better in every single game this season, and he probably has his toughest matchup yet coming this week against the Baltimore Ravens. I still think he's a safe running back 2 play nonetheless. Now moving on to number 17, I got Rhamondre Stevenson. Stevenson, he plays against the Houston Texans, and he rushed 12 times for 89 yards and a touchdown last week and brought in all 4 targets for 3 yards in the Patriots' 15-10 loss to the Dolphins on Sunday. Now Stevenson was supposed to be benched in this one, but he responded well. He posted his best fantasy finish since week 1, and Stevenson should still be looked at as the lead back in this backfield and should be a very solid play this week against the Houston Texans. And now my last and final player in this tier, and there's kind of a caveat with this too because he's injured, but running back 18, Joe Mixon is going to be the guy. Joe Mixon was out for a 3rd week in a row last week after suffering a high ankle sprain in week 2 against the Bears, and head coach DeMeco Ryans said on Monday that they don't know whether Mixon will be able to return for Sunday's game at New England or not. So for now, I'm going to put him here in my rankings, but this ranking will change as we get more information throughout the week. Obviously, if he's trending down, we're probably going to pull him even further down our rankings or maybe even out of the rankings. If he's trending well, we'll probably move him up a little bit as well. But now let's move on to tier 5. Tier 5, we're going to call these the fringe running back 2s, so they're just on that line there. Number 19, Najee Harris. He plays against the Las Vegas Raiders, and Harris, he rushed 14 times for 42 yards, and he caught both of his targets for 35 yards in Sunday's loss to the Cowboys. Now, Najee, he's been fairly inefficient for most of the season, and the Steelers really haven't been a high-powered offense by any means, but this week's matchup against Las Vegas should give Najee another week where he can perform as a running back too. Coming in at 20 for me, this is where I'm going to put Travis Etienne, and he plays against the Chicago Bears. Etienne, he rushed 6 times for 17 yards, and he brought in 6 of his 7 targets for 43 yards in the Jaguars' win over the Colts on Sunday. Etienne has been said to have been dealing with this shoulder injury, and it's kind of been pulling him off the field at times, but every time he does, Tank Bigsby comes in and he looks good. There's an argument that Bigsby will start seeing more touches moving forward, which is really going to cap Etienne's upside, especially this week in an international game in London against a good Bears defense. Now coming in at my running back 21, I do have Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. He plays against the New York Giants, and Brown, he carried the ball 12 times for 46 yards, and he caught all 3 of his targets for 8 yards in Sunday's overtime loss to the Ravens. That said, Chase Brown, he also had a 2-point conversion in this one. He led the Bengals in rushing yards. He saw 15 or more touches for the second straight game, and there's a small chance that he could have the backfield to himself here in week 6 against the Giants. As Zach Moss, he suffered an ankle injury late in the fourth quarter, so we'll still wait on that one. Obviously, if Moss is not playing, we're probably moving Brown up the ranks. Now let's talk about running back 22. I got J.K. Dobbins of the Los Angeles Chargers. They play on the road at the Denver Broncos, and Dobbins, he's coming off of a week 5 bye, and it was probably much needed for the Los Angeles Chargers as they had a lot of injuries on the offensive side of the football, and they just had 2 tough matchups against the Steelers and the Chiefs defenses. However, this week's matchup against Denver, it isn't great for Dobbins either, as the Broncos have ranked pretty well against the fantasy football running back position this year. They currently rank 11th against the position, so he comes in for me as a fringe running back too. And now the last player in this tier, coming in at 23, I got Rico Dowdle of the Dallas Cowboys. They play against the Detroit Lions this week, and Dowdle, he rushed 20 times for 87 yards while catching both of his targets for 27 yards and a touchdown in Sunday's win over the Steelers. Dowdle has slowly taken over this backfield and is now the full-time starter, it looks like. And this week's matchup against Detroit will be tough as they currently rank 7th against the running back position, but Dowdle is definitely trending up in fantasy football. Now moving on to tier 6. Tier 6, we're going to call these the low upside running back 3s. Coming in as my number 24 guy, I got Trey Sermon. He plays on the road at the Tennessee Titans, and Sermon, he rushed 10 times for 38 yards and a touchdown, and he brought in all 6 targets for 25 yards in the Colts' 37-34 loss to the Jaguars on Sunday. Sermon, he was filling in for an injured Jonathan Taylor, who is no guarantee to be back in the lineup this week. However, this matchup against Tennessee is much tougher than last week's matchup, and there's a chance that Joe Flacco is not the quarterback, which might dampen this whole offense entirely. Now moving on to 25, here's where I'm going to put Tyrone Tracy Jr. He plays against the Cincinnati Bengals, and Tracy, he rushed 18 times for 129 yards, and he caught 1 of 2 targets for 1 yard in Sunday's win over the Seahawks. Tracy has likely earned a larger role for week 6 against the Bengals and beyond, although at this point, I don't believe Tracy has done enough to remove Singletary as the starter, whose health is still in question for week 6, and I'm going to operate as if he is out. So this is right now where I'm going to put Tyrone Tracy. Now coming in at 26, I'm going to put Rachaad White of the Tampa Bay Bucks. They play the New Orleans Saints, and White, he rushed 10 times for 72 yards, and he secured all 3 targets for -6 yards in the Buccaneers' overtime loss to the Falcons on Thursday night. White, he saw just a little bit more work than backfield mate Bucky Irving, and he had the better statistical day. It's also worth noting, though, that White broke off a 56-yard run, and he went for 1.7 yards per carry on his other 9 rushing attempts. Now, moving on to 27, here's where I'm going to put Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. They play on the road at the Philadelphia Eagles, and Ford, he carried the ball 9 times for 47 yards and caught all 3 of his targets for 2 yards in Sunday's loss to the Commanders. Ford saw his production on the ground matched by Donta Foreman, which capped Ford's upside, but this Browns offense is struggling, and Nick Chubb is on the verge of returning here soon, so Jerome Ford, he's probably a guy we're not going to be playing for much longer. Moving on to number 28, here's where I'm going to put Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams plays against the Los Angeles Chargers, and Williams, he rushed the ball 13 times for 61 yards in Sunday's win over the Raiders. He added 5 receptions on 6 targets for 50 yards, and Williams is coming off of his best performance of the year by far, and has still failed to find the end zone in 2024. This week's matchup versus Los Angeles, it could be much tougher though, as Los Angeles is currently the 3rd toughest matchup for opposing running backs. Now coming in at 29, I am going to put Zach Moss of the Bengals here. Moss, he rushed 9 times for 24 yards, and he brought in 3 of 4 targets for 28 yards in Sunday's loss to the Ravens. As I mentioned, he suffered an ankle injury in this game, but it is being reported as minor. So depending on his availability here this week, if he plays, I do still like Chase Brown more than Moss, but if he doesn't play, obviously we'll pull him out of the rankings. For now, this profiles to be a decent matchup for both Moss and Brown, and this is where I would have these guys ranked. And now the last and final player here in this low-end running back 3 territory, I do got Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. As I mentioned, they play the New Orleans Saints, and Irving, he rushed 9 times for 44 yards, and he brought in both targets for 12 yards in the Buccaneers' loss to the Falcons. Irving, he lost a fumble late in the game that ultimately cost them the game here in this one, but this week's matchup against the Saints, it will likely bring another 50-50 timeshare here for Tampa Bay. And now my last and final tier, let's go to tier 7. These are flex plays at best, at absolute best. But coming in at 31, Tank Bigsby of the Jacksonville Jaguars. As I mentioned, they play the Chicago Bears in London, and Bigsby, he rushed 13 times for 101 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he secured his only target for 28 yards in the Jaguars' win over the Colts on Sunday. He also committed a fumble that he recovered in the end zone for his own score, and Bigsby could be in line for much more work here this week in London and should be considered a fine flex play this week. Now moving on to my number 32 guy, I got Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears. Again, London guy, London game, you know the deal. Johnson, he rushed 10 times for 25 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Bears' 36-10 win over the Panthers on Sunday. Although Roschon has just been a complimentary piece to Swift up to this point, he has seen a decent amount of goal line work and has a good matchup this week against the Jags, who are ranked 26th in the NFL against running backs, so we could see some more goal line opportunities here in week 6. Now, coming in at 33, I am going to put Braylon Allen of the Jets. Allen, he rushed the ball 5 times for 13 yards in Sunday's 23-17 loss to the Vikings. He added 1 reception on 2 targets for 15 yards as well. He also averaged only 2.6 yards per carry, and he had a long gain of just 7 yards in this one. Obviously not a good day from the running backs overall there in New York in last week's game versus the Vikings, but this week's matchup versus Buffalo should be better for Allen, as the Bills currently rank 31st against opposing running backs. Now 34, this is where I'm going to put Alexander Mattison of the Las Vegas Raiders. He gets a tough matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers this week, and Mattison, he rushed the ball 15 times for 38 yards in Sunday's loss to the Broncos. He also added 2 receptions on 3 targets for 23 yards as well. As I mentioned, this is going to be a much tougher matchup this week against a good Steelers defense, so I would expect a little bit more of the same here this week, especially if Jahmyr White remains sidelined, which it looks like he might remain sidelined here in this one. Now 35, this is where I'm going to put Tyler Algier. He plays the Carolina Panthers, as I mentioned, and Algier, he had 6 carries for 12 yards against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They won that one 36-30. He also added 3 receptions for another 13 yards receiving, and Algier, he has continued to see his snap share increase week after week, and it looks like he has a great matchup here this week against Carolina, which does make me comfortable enough to flex him if my team is in a pinch. And now my last and final player here in today's episode, coming in at 36, Tyjae Spears of the Tennessee Titans. They play against the Indianapolis Colts, and Tyjae Spears, he's coming off of his week 5 bye week, but he gets a matchup here this week against the Colts, who have been very bad against opposing running backs. That said, he's still just a complimentary piece to Tony Pollard, but as we saw in week 4 versus the Miami Dolphins, if he can find the end zone, he can still be a decent desperation play for our fantasy football team. So there you have it. That's my top 36 running backs as of this moment as we go into week 6 of the fantasy football season. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you get the updates as they come in throughout the week. Also, make sure you are a member of the Discord. That way you can ask any questions to me. It is free to join that Discord. It is linked in the description, so there is no risk in joining because, as I mentioned, it's free to join. And if you like today's video, make sure you hit the like button. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.